On the day they buried his grandfather, an 18-year-old boy with nowhere left to sleep was handed a $5 receipt and a tarnished brass key to a lumber mill that had been sealed shut for 41 years. What waited inside that mill wasn't just stacked wood and silent machines. It was the answer to a question his grandfather had carried to the grave, and the beginning of the only life that had ever truly been his own. If you have ever felt like the people who loved you left before they could tell you what they meant to, hit that subscribe button. This story is for you. It's the story of how I learned that some inheritances arrive in your hand, and some of them you have to walk into. The day they buried Arthur Vance, the sky was the color of dishwater, and the wind off the ridge had teeth. I stood at the edge of the open grave, with my hands shoved into the pockets of a borrowed wool coat that smelled faintly of mothballs and pipe tobacco, and I watched 4 men I did not know lower the only family I had left into the frozen ground. I was 18. I had aged out of the county group home 3 weeks before he died, on a Tuesday afternoon, with a duffel bag and a check for $250 and a list of shelters in 3 counties. I had been sleeping on the cot at the back of his hospital room ever since. The pastor said something about a man who had built things with his hands. The wind took most of the words. Afterward, a small woman in a navy coat touched my elbow. She had the permanently tired sympathy of a person whose job was to be present at the worst moments of other people's lives, and she introduced herself as Mrs. Albright from the county. She said she had been told to make sure I knew about an appointment that afternoon. 2 o'clock. Above the hardware store in town. A lawyer named Alistair Finch. He's been trying to reach you for a week, she said. Your grandfather asked him to wait until after the service. She pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm with the address on it. Good luck, Caleb. Flat. The way you say it to a boy whose name you will not remember by Friday. In the duffel bag at my feet I had everything I owned. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 undershirts, a worn paperback copy of East of Eden with the cover creased into a soft curl. A faded photograph of my grandfather standing in front of a long, low building with a tall metal smokestack, his arm around a younger man I did not recognize. And, wrapped in a square of red flannel at the bottom of the bag, my grandfather's small, leather-bound tally book, the one he had kept in the breast pocket of his work coat for as long as I had known him. Pencil marks, board feet, names of men long dead. He had pressed it into my hand on his last clear morning and said, Caleb, don't lose this. I had not yet opened it. I was afraid of what it would mean to read a dead man's handwriting. Mr. Alistair Finch's office sat above George's Hardware on Main Street, up a narrow staircase that smelled of old paper and furniture polish. He was a small man, with neatly trimmed white hair and spectacles he looked at me over the top of, and when I sat down across his desk, he did not offer condolences. He set a green folder between us. He cleared his throat. His voice was a dry rustle, the sound of leaves in a closed room. Your grandfather, he said, was a careful man. He prepared for this conversation for a long time. He turned the folder so I could read it. The will is simple. 80 acres on the south slope of Hollow Ridge, bordering the Cascade River. A house on the property, which I understand is no longer habitable, and a lumber mill. The Vance and Crane Sawmill, closed in 1983. Sealed by your grandfather himself with a chain and a single padlock. He paid the property taxes on the mill every year of his life, in cash, in person, at the county recorder's office. There is one outstanding fee on the property as of this morning, $5. I stared at him. $5? Your grandfather had a particular sense of humor about symbolic gestures, he said. His mouth moved in something that was almost a smile, and then thought better of it. He left specific instructions. $5 is the cost of taking possession. The mill has not been opened since 1983. He left you the key. He slid a small, tarnished brass key across the desk. It was warm from his palm. You should know, Mr. Finch said, that there is an active offer on the property. Has been for a long time. A company called Oak Ridge Development has been asking your grandfather to sell every year for the last 14 years. The offer is currently $7,500 for the entire 80 acres, mill included, sight unseen. The principal of Oak Ridge Development is a man named Silas Crane. He paused. I believe you can see his face in the photograph in your bag. The younger man in the photo, the arm around his shoulder. Your grandfather and Mr. Crane were partners, Mr. Finch said, from 1948 until 1983. The partnership ended badly. Your grandfather never spoke of it to me in detail. He did, however, leave a letter for you, to be read only after you had been to the mill yourself. $7,500. I felt it the way a man with empty pockets feels the smell of bread through a bakery window. A deposit on a room. A coat that was actually mine. A pair of work boots not handed down through the group home. A real start. But the tally book was heavy at the bottom of the bag, and Arthur Vance had paid $5 a year for 41 years to keep a sealed building in his name. And he had pressed that tally book into my hand and asked me not to lose it. I want to see it, I said. The words came out before I had decided them. I'm not selling, not until I've seen it. Mr. Finch did not nod, but he placed both his hands flat on the desk in a way that felt like a man setting down a heavy thing he had been carrying for a long time. Tomorrow, he said. George downstairs can drive you. He knew your grandfather. Take the key. Take the letter when you come back to me. It was the stupidest decision I could have made. It was the only one I could live with. George of George's Hardware was a thick-shouldered man with white stubble and forearms like split firewood. And when I walked in the next morning to ask for the ride, he looked at me over the cash register and let out a slow, considering breath. Arthur's grandson, he said. It was not a question. I'll be damned. I wondered if he'd ever bring you around. He took down a heavy ring of keys from a hook. Son, that mill's been asleep longer than I've been alive, and I'm older than dirt by 2 coats of paint. You sure about this? I said I was. Then let's see what your grandfather was keeping from the world. The truck climbed out of town on a road that turned to gravel and then to packed dirt, between fences of split rail and through stands of fir thick enough to swallow the daylight. The air through the cracked window changed its smell from gasoline to pine needles and damp earth. We crossed a wooden bridge over the Cascade River. George pointed at a fork in the road I would not have seen on my own. He turned off. We climbed. Halfway up, he pulled over at a gas station so I could use the payphone. I called Mrs. Albright at the county office to leave the address where I would be that night, so my paperwork would not lapse. She said, in a softer voice than she had used the day before, Caleb, be careful with whatever you find up there. There are people in town who have wanted that property for a long time. You do not owe any of them an answer today. I had no idea the truck climbing back onto that gravel road was about to deliver me to the most important door I would ever open. The house came into view first. Long and low and gray, with a sagging porch and 3 windows broken on the side that faced the wind. My heart sank. Then George drove past it, around a bend, into a clearing, and the mill came into view. It was larger than the photograph had suggested. A long building of weathered cedar with a tall metal smokestack pointed at the sky and a heavy sliding door at the front held shut by a single iron chain looped through 2 rusted hasps and clasped by a padlock so old that rust had bled down the wood in a long brown streak. The whole building looked as if it were holding its breath. What I saw waiting for me there made me want to turn around. I'm glad I didn't. George stayed in the truck. "This part," he said, "is yours." I walked to the door. I took out the brass key. I fit it into the padlock. There was a loud, protesting screech of metal on metal, and then a solid, satisfying clunk, and the lock sprang open in my hand. I unwound the chain, link by link, and let it fall to the frozen ground. I leaned my shoulder into the door. It moved an inch, then a foot. Then it slid back on its rusted track with a sound like a long sigh, and a wave of musty, stale air washed over me, thick with the smell of sawdust and pipe tobacco and trapped time. Shafts of dusty sunlight cut through the gloom from cracks in the roof. The building was cavernous. My footsteps echoed on the worn plank floor. The shapes of the great machines stood under canvas tarps like sleeping animals, the big band saw still threaded with a blade gone the color of dried blood, the planer with its feed table furred in 41 years of dust. Along the far wall, stacked from the floor to the rafters in long, careful rows, were the slabs. I had been around lumber my whole boyhood. My grandfather had taught me to know the difference between cherry and maple by the weight in your hand. But I had never seen wood like this. The slabs were enormous. Black walnut, some of them 6 feet across at the heart, air-dried for so long the color had gone the deep brown of old molasses. Burls the size of farm sinks. A few pieces of figured maple so deeply quilted they looked like water frozen mid-current. And in the corner, under a separate tarp, 3 full logs of something I did not at first recognize until I saw the deep purple grain at the cut end. Pre-ban, old growth. The kind of wood that had not been legally harvested in this country in my lifetime. In the center of the floor, under a single shaft of pale light from a crack in the roof, sat a heavy, iron-bound footlocker, just one, waiting. I knelt in front of it. My hands were shaking in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The hasp was not locked. I lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was money. Banded stacks of $100 bills. The bands dated from years I had been alive and from years I had not. The bills themselves, a mix of the new and the old. I pulled out one stack and counted with fingers that no longer felt like my own. $5,000. I picked up another. 5,000. I stopped counting at the 8th. There was a tally written in pencil on the inside of the lid in a hand I now knew. 60,200. Caleb. Down payment on a life. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. I sat down hard on the cold plank floor. A strange, choked sound came out of me that echoed off the rafters of the mill, and for a long moment I thought I was laughing, and then I realized I was not. And then it turned into something deeper, a long, shuddering thing that came up from a place I did not know I owned. I thought of the cot at the back of the hospital room. I thought of the borrowed wool coat that did not fit. I thought of a man who had paid $5 a year for 41 years to keep a door closed until I was old enough to open it. I sat there until the light moved. When I could stand again, I saw the second thing. At the back of the footlocker, beneath the last layer of oilcloth, was a flat tin lunch pail. Inside the pail were 3 items, set deliberately in a row. A thick envelope addressed in spidery handwriting to one name, Caleb. A leather-bound journal, fat with use, its spine cracked along the seam. And on top of both, a small folded square of paper with 8 words written across it in a hand that had grown unsteady toward the end. The journal first, the letter second. Be patient. I sat on the plank floor of the mill until the sun went down, and I read the journal cover to cover. It was a daily ledger of my grandfather's life, kept in spare pencil from the year 1948 to the month before his stroke. The entries from the early years were terse. Board feet milled, crew paid, the price of fuel. Then, in 1948, the partnership entries began. The name Silas Crane appeared on nearly every page. The two of them had built the mill together, leveraging Arthur's 80 acres against Silas's connections at the bank. The first decade was prosperous. The entries grew warmer. Birthday notes, the births of children, a handwritten copy of a sales contract for the downstream tract. Then, in the spring of 1983, the entries turned cold. Silas had borrowed against the partnership without my grandfather's knowledge to buy the downstream tract in his own name only. When my grandfather found out, he confronted him. Silas threatened him with a fabricated audit of the mill's books that would have cost Arthur his half of the property and his federal timber permits. Arthur could fight in a court he could not afford and lose. Or he could sign the partnership dissolution, walk away with the 80 acres and the mill, and let Silas have the downstream tract clean. He chose the second. He sealed the mill that summer. He never milled another board. But he did not stop working. He spent the next 41 years quietly accumulating, one tree at a time, the most valuable wood the region had ever produced. He bought the burls from estate sales. He bought the walnut slabs at auction from small farms going under. He paid for them out of pocket. He stacked them in his sealed mill against the day his only grandson would have a reason to open the door. His final entries, written in the unsteady hand of his last year, were almost all about me. Caleb in town today, looking thin. Caleb finished the book I gave him. Caleb did not say much at the table tonight, but he stayed. I closed the journal. I opened the letter. It was 4 pages long. He wrote that he had not been able to take me in himself when my parents died because the county would not place a child with a man living alone in a falling-down house, and he had spent 2 years fighting that decision through a court that he could not, in the end, defeat. He wrote that the worst hours of his life had been spent watching me grow up in a group home 12 miles from a house with his name on the deed. He wrote that he had paid $5 a year for 41 years on a sealed mill because he had needed a place to put what he could not give me directly. He wrote that the wood in the mill, properly sold to a specialty buyer in the city, would buy me a real start. He wrote that the journal was the proof of what Silas Crane had done. And he wrote in the last lines that Oak Ridge Development could not build the resort they had been planning on the ridge for 14 years without the timber rights deed that he had filed against the entire 80 acres in 1984, the year after the partnership ended, as quiet insurance. His last line was underlined in pencil by a hand that had grown unsteady. The foundation is the key. Everything starts with the foundation. So this wasn't just a sealed lumber mill, it was the beginning of the rest of my life. The next several weeks were a blur of hard physical labor. I moved into the long gray house with George's help and a roll of tar paper, and we patched the worst of the roof before the first hard rain. I chopped wood until my hands blistered and bled and hardened. I learned to draw water from the well with the hand pump. A retired sawyer named Hollis, who had worked for my grandfather in the late 70s, drove out one Saturday with a thermos of coffee and a tool roll and spent the next 8 Saturdays helping me bring the bandsaw back from the dead. I read books on lumber grading at the town library on Thursdays. I called a specialty wood dealer whose name was tucked into the back of my grandfather's tally book, and a man named Mr. Whitfield drove out the following Wednesday. He walked the rows. He laid a hand on a walnut slab. He did not speak for a long time. Then he turned to me and said, very quietly, "Son, there has not been wood like this on the open market in this country in 40 years. Do not let anyone tell you what it is worth before you let me tell you what it is worth." A clean white envelope arrived at the post office in my name a few days later. The Oak Ridge Development letterhead was crisp and expensive. The offer had risen. $60,000 for the 80 acres. The signature at the bottom was Silas Crane. A second letter, a week after that, mentioned eminent domain, mentioned blight, mentioned a county petition. They were getting nervous. They did not yet know what I knew. I walked into Mr. Alistair Finch's office on a Tuesday morning in late March, not knowing it would be the most important meeting of my life. He had already arranged everything. The journal sat on his desk, opened to the entry from August 1983. The 1984 timber rights filing sat next to it, certified, stamped, indisputable. The original partnership dissolution paperwork showed Silas Crane's downstream tract acquired through funds borrowed against the joint partnership, an undisclosed debt that under state law in 1983 had been actionable fraud. Two men in expensive suits sat across the desk from us. One of them was Silas Crane. He was older than the photograph, heavier in the jaw. His smile was the kind that did not change when the conversation did. He spoke of partnership. He spoke of progress. He spoke of how a young man, alone in the world, ought to think very carefully about turning down the kind of opportunity most boys his age would never see in a lifetime. He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. The number on it was $475,000. I felt the tally book in my coat pocket. I felt the blisters on my palms. I thought of my grandfather, 2 years dead in his fight with the county, watching me from 12 miles away. I thought of his last entry. Caleb stayed. No, I said. Silas Crane set down his pen. He told me, quietly, that there would not be another offer. Mr. Finch slid a folder of his own across the table. My client is not selling, he said, his dry voice perfectly even. However, my client is prepared to grant Oak Ridge Development a 50-year limited timber easement on the northern 14 acres of the property under the following non-negotiable terms. First, a community trust will be established for the residents of Hollow Ridge Township, funded by an annual fee of $45,000 in perpetuity, indexed to inflation, administered by an independent board. Second, conservation restrictions will be placed on the remaining 66 acres in perpetuity, with the mill itself protected as a working historic site. Third, the original 1948 partnership dissolution paperwork, along with the journal entries documenting the fraudulent acquisition of the downstream tract, will be filed with the State Attorney General's office at noon on Friday, unless Oak Ridge Development agrees in writing by Thursday at 5 p.m. to return the downstream tract to my client at the purchase price your firm paid for it in 1983. Adjusted for inflation, not $1 more. Fourth, my client retains every board foot of inventory inside the mill, free and clear, with no claim from any party. The taller suit's smile slipped first. Silas Crane's did not. But his hand on the table closed slowly into a fist, and the knuckles whitened, and I watched a man who had spent 41 years building a life on a quiet theft realize that the bill had come due in a room he did not control. They walked out without answering. They signed every term within 11 days. The downstream tract came back into the family name on a Friday in April. I stood with Mr. Finch on the courthouse steps, and we watched a county recorder hand a deed to a boy in a borrowed wool coat that by then had begun to feel like it might actually fit. Mr. Whitfield's specialty wood crew took 2 weeks to inventory the mill, and another 6 to negotiate the sale of the first lot. The walnut alone, properly graded and properly placed, sold for more than the developer's final offer. The burls went to a furniture maker in another state who wept on the phone when I described them. The old-growth logs I kept. They are still in the mill, under their tarp, waiting for a use my grandfather would have approved of. I rebuilt the long gray house through the spring and into the summer. I patched the roof properly. I replaced 3 windows. I sanded the kitchen floor down to the original maple. I had a real electrician run a new line from the road, and one evening in June, just after the light went the color of old brass, I flipped the switch by the door and the kitchen overhead came on, steady and warm. Real electricity, the first time. On the mantel above the wood stove sat my grandfather's tally book, closed, the cover smoothed by 40 years of his thumb. I had not put it there as a memorial. I had put it there because I still consulted it every week. There were names in it of men who were still alive. There were prices in it that still applied. It wasn't a house, it was a home. I stand on the porch sometimes now, in the early evening, when the smoke from the chimney climbs straight up into a sky that has nothing to prove, and I think about a boy in a borrowed coat at the edge of a grave who was certain he had been left with nothing. I think about a man who paid $5 a year for 41 years because he had been beaten in a corkroom he could not afford and refused, all the same, to lose. My grandfather could not raise me. He could not, in the end, even hold my hand at the door of the home I had grown up in. But he could seal a building. He could stack the wood. He could pay $5 a year for as long as he had a hand to write a check with. He could leave a key on a lawyer's desk and trust that the boy he had watched from 12 miles away would, on the day it mattered, turn it. My inheritance was not the lumber. It was the chance to walk into a life that someone had been building for me, quietly, in the dark, for as long as I had been alive. The most valuable things are often hidden under layers of rust and neglect. A silence can become a love letter. An absence can become the longest act of devotion a person is capable of. If you have ever felt like the people who loved you left before they could tell you what they meant to, I want you to hear me. They were not silent because they did not love you. Sometimes the love had to wait for you to be old enough to find it. There is a key somewhere in your life, and it is probably tarnished, and it is probably on a desk you have not yet walked up to. Walk up to it anyway. Tell me, in the comments below, about the inheritance you did not realize you had received until long after the person who left it to you was gone. I want to know whose silence turned out to be a letter to you. I read every single one. Thank you for listening.